Welcome back to the Creatively Curious podcast. I'm your host, Ashley Walter. In this week's episode, I'll be reviewing CVP Week 7, which is on color aspects. Last week we did color value, and so it's just a continuation of our exploration of color. And I'll admit, for the record, I felt this way last year as well. I feel a bit overwhelmed with keeping up with the work, and so I'm a little bit behind in the exercises, and I feel like my brain is confused by some of the information. Some of it was new to me last year, and even like the saturation, which I'll talk more about. I have to wrap my head around that, although I think I'm understanding it more this year. So this week we went through, let's see. So there were 5 components of color. The 5 components are value, complements, saturation, harmony, and temperature. So last week I talked about value and complements, so you can check that episode out. And then this week I'm going to be talking about saturation, temperature, and harmony. So the takeaways were saturation is the intensity or vibrancy of color. Color harmony occurs when all the colors share a common color. Glazing creates color harmony and transparency. And this is the opposite of painting thick, which Nick Wilton often emphasizes is to paint really thick, and that's called opacity. Vibrant, highly saturated secondary colors can only be created with primary colors that share a common color bias. So they're near each other on the color wheel. And color differences are more noticeable as value contrast lessens or decreases. So a lot has been pushed for value contrast. So like basically black and white are very contrasty. And so it's kind of been emphasized that we have a lot of contrast in the painting. But if you're wanting to emphasize color, then you would decrease that value contrast and just focus on the color differences. So that's kind of like artist choice. You decide what you want to focus on and what the emphasis is in your painting, and then you go from there. So I'll break down saturation, temperature, and harmony a little bit further. So saturation is basically like the primary colors or colors that come out of a tube of paint is highly, highly saturated color. And so there are 4 ways to change the saturation. And so I'll just go over them. You can add white, which creates a tint. You can add black, which creates a shade. You can add gray, which is combining white and black to create a tone. And then you can add the complementary color, which also decreases the saturation. So I went over that last week. So complementary colors, you can see if you're watching the video, I have a painting actually that is red and green primarily. So those are complementary colors. You have orange and blue, and yellow and purple or violet are the complementary colors. So if you mix those together, then they'll really decrease the saturation. And that I feel like that piece was new to me last year, and obviously not new to me this year, but that is one thing I'm not really good at is mixing the complementary color. I will add white, I'll add black, and then I guess because of CVP, then I'll sometimes add other colors into the color, but that's something good to remember and creates those more neutral kind of browns, greens together, which I don't actually paint a lot in. So maybe that's a challenge for me is to look more at that. So that's saturation. Temperature is, when you think of colors, like if you think of the sun or a sunrise, like you think of that as being a warm color. So that's yellow, orange, red. And then cooler colors would be, I always just automatically think of blue, um, and violet, and then green. And so that's kind of typically like if you look at a color wheel, which again I had showed last week, if you're watching the video, or you could even just Google color wheel, and then the warms are on one side of the color wheel and the cools are on the other side. But actually, each primary color could be cool or warm. So typically, like when they use primary colors on a color wheel, it'll almost be both. But you can have, did I write them down? Yeah. So like a cadmium red light, for example, would be warmer and a magenta would be cooler. So they'd be different places on the color wheel. And thinking of colors in terms of their biases will help you mix them. And so then this is where it kind of hurt my brain a little bit is because I didn't realize this, I think, until CVP last year, is that if you're wanting to mix an orange, then you would want to use a warmer red and a warmer yellow to mix that and to create a beautiful orange. But then if you're doing mixing like a purple, you'd want to use a cool red. Hopefully I'm getting this right. And then like a cool blue to make the purple. And sometimes I would just be mixing, I wouldn't think about that. And so you'd mix a red, mix a blue, and it would almost make a brown. And so that's like the red probably has more orange in it, which is the complement of blue. So then it's desaturating the blue and making more of a neutral. So I feel like this is a bit for me more challenging, but so I won't really get into too much detail on that. But ultimately, like, generally colors have temperatures, warm, cool, but then actually the color the primary colors themselves could be warmer or cool depending on which blue you're using, depending on which yellow you're using, depending on which red you're using. And then when you go to mix those colors, it will depend on which ones you're using, warm or cool, to mix with which other warm or cool primary. So interesting, something for more thought. Now, this feels challenging to me because it does definitely feels like I'm then in my left brain thinking about all the colors, which I don't I'm not there when I'm painting. I like to just get totally over into my right brain and let things flow, and I'm not really thinking about this. So I don't know. There it is. Um, Harmony. So harmony of the colors, you can mix some mother colors. So that's when you take all the colors of your painting, mix them together, and then use that mother color in each of the colors. So that also is new to me. And colors generally get better when they are made with more colors. So again, this is not something I thought about when I was making paintings before. I mentioned last week too, I have some paintings happening that I'm not mixing a mother color. I'm not doing that. So I'm not sure. I think they're still working, but I definitely have been using glazing, which I learned about. And so that's like, I guess there's a few different ways you could do that. You can use paint that's just, some paints are more transparent than other paints. And again, I'm talking about acrylics here. Um, but then you can mix water with that acrylic paint to water it down and use that as a glaze. You could do that over the whole painting or just parts of paintings. I have a tendency for some reason to use gloss medium, mixing it with the paint and then bringing that over different areas of the painting, usually not the whole painting itself, but different sections. And especially if I've painted one part a color, then sometimes I'll just put gloss medium on this wedge tool, and then I bring that, I usually wait a couple minutes so it gets a little bit tacky, it's a little bit drier, and then I can bring that paint down into other sections of the painting, so that kind of creates a glaze. And then colors that share one color are in harmony, so that creates a little bit of harmony that way if I'm bringing the other colors kind of over top of colors that are already laid down. So that's that. Let's see. So the glazes are more transparent, and you can put the glaze on, wipe it off with a paper towel. That would be, I think, if you use the water mixed with paint. I'll have to try that. I haven't really tried that. I usually use the gloss medium, which you can also wipe off. And then I guess as a general rule, have no more than 50% of your painting glazed. Like if you just glaze the entire painting with one color, then that would be maybe just too much of the same, because then it creates the same value. Then there's no value contrast really. Obviously, you get to do what you want. There's no rules, just guidelines. And then one other piece, yeah, that I mentioned earlier was reducing the value contrast to optimize color. So if you're really wanting to focus on the colors instead of high contrast, then this makes the colors more noticeable and allows the viewer to appreciate the colors as opposed to drawing attention to specific areas of the painting because the value contrast is so high. So it depends what your goal is. If your goal is to emphasize color, then you might want to reduce the value contrast and the colors become more noticeable. If your goal is to highlight, like be really bold, then you'd want to focus on the value contrast. So that's where we're at this week. Feeling a little bit overwhelmed, a little bit behind, but there is another catch up week coming up. So next week will be on texture, which I really, really love, love, love. Uh, I'm trying to think if I painted that way before this course, but I love scraping and gouging and sanding and doing all those things now. So I do a lot of that. And so I'll cover that in next week's podcast. And then I have a rest week. So then I'll be able to catch up on all my work. And then I'm doing here in Edmonton, we have the White Avenue Art Walk that is July, I want to say 11th, 12th, 13th. Hopefully those dates are right. So I'll be there at that art walk. So I'll be talking a little bit more about that. So I'm working on some paintings for that art walk that have a lot of texture, have some bold colors. I did a piece actually in my sketchbook that I'd love to make into a painting. And one of the things I really liked about it was the paint. Sometimes when I have leftover paint on my palette, then I'll put it in like a little Tupperware and save it because I don't like to waste things. But the paint, I left it maybe a bit too long, or did I? Because it got really thick and like not dry, but it just got thick in the Tupperware. And so I use that like with a palette knife to kind of scrape it into my sketchbook, and I loved that effect. And so I'm wondering, Nick talked in, we had a call today in the call about how he adds pigment into his paint to thicken it up. So maybe, and there's another artist that I follow, I can't remember her name, Samantha something. She paints really, really thick. And so she'll add a golden product into her paint to thicken it up and then put that on the canvas. So I need to look into that too, because I loved how that felt, like scooping it with the palette knife and then scraping that onto the page. Just felt really good. So I'm going to try some of that for my pieces for the art walk. So, and if you have any questions or comments, I'd love to hear from you. You can put them below the podcast episode or on the YouTube channel. And if you like this podcast, please rate it and review it and subscribe. And I'll see you next week. Thanks so much for tuning in.